It started with a dog, a lone soaked figure standing under a flickering streetlight. His fur was matted with rain, his ribs pressed against his skin, but he wasn't lost. He wasn't begging for food. No, he was waiting, watching. The storm raged above, but the dog never moved. His dark eyes were locked onto the police station across the road, unblinking, as if he was trying to speak. And then he did something strange. He stepped forward, stopped, looked back, stepped forward again, stopped, looked back. A silent plea. Inside the station, Inspector Adewale noticed. Years of police work had trained him to spot unusual behavior. And this wasn't normal. He stood watching the dog. A strange feeling gnawed at him. "What do you want, boy?" he muttered. The dog's ears twitched. Then, as if he understood, he turned and ran. Adewale hesitated. The logical part of his mind told him to ignore it. But his gut told him to follow. And so, he did. He didn't know it yet. But he was about to uncover a murder that only this dog could solve. The dog led him through winding alleyways, past silent houses, and into the forest that bordered the village. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of rain and leaves. The dog's paws left faint prints in the mud as he trotted ahead. Then he stopped. His ears perked. He whined softly. Adewale raised his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. And then he saw it. A hand, pale, still, partially buried beneath a thin layer of leaves. Adewale's breath caught in his throat. He rushed forward, brushing away the dirt. It was a man's body, lifeless, his face frozen in fear. The officer's heart pounded. Who was he? What had happened to him? He turned to the dog, who now sat beside the body, his eyes filled with something almost human. Sadness, regret, or was it guilt? Adewale pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Inspector Adewale. I need backup. We have a homicide." The dog let out a low whimper, then turned and vanished into the trees. By morning, the entire crime scene was surrounded by officers. The victim was identified, a local businessman named Tunde, missing for 2 days. But there was no weapon, no sign of struggle. Just one strange detail: dog prints around the body. Could it be a wild animal attack? One officer suggested. Adewale shook his head. No, that dog knew where to find me. He wanted me to see this. The officers spread out, searching for clues. Meanwhile, Adewale had one mission: find that dog. He asked around. "Does anyone know this dog?" Finally, an old woman stepped forward. "That dog belongs to Mr. Tunde. He called him Simba. They were inseparable." Adewale's heart skipped. The victim's dog. But why had Simba led him to the body? Was he just mourning his owner? Or was he trying to say something? That night, Adewale sat in his office, staring at the evidence. The rain pattered against the window. The case didn't add up. Then, suddenly, a soft scratch at the door. He turned. There, standing in the dim light, was Simba, soaking wet, eyes pleading. Without a word, Adewale stood up. "All right, boy, show me." Simba led him back into the night, through the streets, down the forest path, until they reached an abandoned hut. The dog stopped at the door and whined. Adewale's fingers tightened around his flashlight. Carefully, he pushed the door open. And there, in the corner of the room, was a man, dirty, trembling, eyes wide with fear. It was Tunde's business partner. Adewale's blood ran cold. He recognized him immediately. They had questioned him earlier. He claimed to know nothing. But Simba knew the truth. The man scrambled back. I didn't mean to." Adewale stepped closer. "Didn't mean to do what?" Simba growled low, his fur bristling. The man's hand shook. Tunde found out I was stealing from him. He threatened to go to the police. I didn't have a choice." He broke down, sobbing. And just like that, the case was solved. Because of a dog. It should have ended there. But something wasn't right. Tunde's murderer was arrested that night. But Adewale couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. Simba still refused to leave his side. Every night the dog would whine, pacing restlessly. It was as if he was trying to say, "It's not over." And then, a new piece of evidence surfaced. Adewale received a report, an autopsy result that made his stomach drop. Tunde hadn't died from a struggle. He had been poisoned. The so-called confession didn't match the real cause of death, which meant the real killer was still out there, and Simba knew it. The next morning, Adewale sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface. The autopsy report lay open in front of him. Cause of death, poisoning. Not strangulation, not a struggle. Poison. The confession from Tunde's business partner suddenly felt wrong. Adewale's jaw clenched. "So he lied," he muttered. Simba, lying at his feet, let out a soft whimper. "You knew, didn't you?" Adewale sighed, reaching down to scratch the dog's head. "That's why you didn't stop." The case wasn't solved. It had just begun. Before Adewale could even process the implications of the report, there was a knock at the door. It was a woman, late 20s, dressed in a dark blue skirt and blouse, her hands clutching a leather handbag like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her eyes were swollen, like she'd been crying. "You're the officer handling Tunde's case?" Her voice was quiet, but firm. Adewale nodded. "Yes." "And you are?" "My name is Amaka. I was Tunde's fiancé." Adewale's eyes widened slightly. This was new information. He gestured for her to sit, but she shook her head. "I won't stay long. I just need to tell you something." Adewale leaned forward. "Go ahead." Amaka swallowed hard. Tunde knew something was going to happen to him. He told me 2 nights before he disappeared. He said he had discovered something dangerous, something that could ruin powerful people. Adewale frowned. "Did he say what it was?" She hesitated. "No." He only said, "If anything happens to me, don't trust the first answer they give you." A cold chill ran down Adewale's spine. She clutched her bag tighter. "Please, find out the truth. I know they arrested his business partner, but that man wasn't smart enough to do this alone." Adewale nodded slowly. "You're right. The case isn't over yet." She gave a small nod, then hesitated. Her eyes moved to Simba, who sat quietly, staring at her. A sad smile crossed her face. He loved that dog more than anything in the world. Simba whined softly. Amaka wiped her eyes and turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, she stopped. "One more thing," she whispered. "Tunde gave me a key before he disappeared. He said if anything happened to him, I should find out what it opened." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a single silver key. Adewale took it carefully. "Do you have any idea what this unlocks?" She shook her head. "No, but I think Simba does." Simba was already up and pacing when Adewale turned to him. "You know, don't you?" Adewale murmured. The dog let out a low bark, then trotted to the door, looking back expectantly. Adewale grabbed his coat. "All right, boy, lead the way." He followed Simba out of the station and through the streets of the city. They passed through narrow alleyways, winding through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Finally, they arrived at a gated compound, rusted, overgrown with weeds, clearly abandoned. Simba whined and pawed at the gate. Adewale tried the key. It fit. With a heavy click, the lock turned, and the gate creaked open. The dog stepped inside first, his tail stiff, his ears alert. Adewale followed, his hand hovering over his holster. The place was eerie, an old, empty house with broken windows and scattered papers on the floor. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Adewale's flashlight flickered over a desk covered in dust. And there, beneath stacks of old files, he saw something that made his breath hitch. A ledger. It had Tunde's name on it. Carefully, he opened it. His eyes widened. Names, transactions, huge amounts of money, shady deals. And at the very top, circled in red ink, was one name that made his stomach drop. A powerful politician. Adewale flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just a simple murder. This was something bigger. Tunde had been on to something dangerous, and whoever had silenced him hadn't done it out of desperation. They had done it to protect a secret. Simba growled softly, his fur bristling. Adewale tensed. He turned slowly. A figure stood in the doorway, a shadow. A gun glinted in the dim light. Adewale barely had time to react before, bang! What's next? Who was the shooter? Adewale's vision swam. Blood soaked his shirt. His arm throbbed with unbearable pain, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was Simba, and Simba was fading fast. He slammed his fist against the glass door of the veterinary clinic. Help! His voice was hoarse, desperate. Please, he's dying! For a long moment, nothing. Then, shuffling footsteps. A light flickered on inside. The door opened just a crack, revealing a man in scrubs. His hair was messy, his eyes tired. He looked at Adewale with an irritated frown. We're closed, the man said flatly. Come back in the morning. Adewale's heart dropped. He felt as if someone had kicked him in the chest. You don't understand, he rasped. He's been shot. He won't survive till morning. The vet sighed, rubbing his forehead. Look, I've had a long day. Clinic hours are over. There's nothing I can do right now. Adewale's breathing turned shallow. Simba let out a weak whimper in his arms, barely able to lift his head. Please, Adewale begged, his voice breaking. You're the only one who can help. The vet shook his head. Rules are rules. He moved to close the door. Adewale snapped. His fingers shot out and gripped the door frame, holding it open. His body shook, not just from pain, but from something deeper, something raw. You listen to me, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. I've been shot. My dog has been shot, and I'm standing here begging you like a fool while he bleeds to death in my hands. The vet stiffened. Adewale took a step forward, his dark eyes burning with fury. I swear on everything I have left, he said slowly, voice trembling with rage. If this dog dies because you refuse to do your job, you will regret it for the rest of your miserable life. A tense silence filled the air. The vet hesitated. You're threatening me? Adewale leaned closer, his voice ice cold. No, I'm making you understand that if you let an innocent life slip away tonight, your conscience will never let you sleep again. The vet swallowed. He glanced at Simba, the dog barely breathing. His fur was soaked in blood. His chest rose and fell in shallow, weak movements. The vet's face paled. Then, finally, bring him in, he muttered. Adewale nearly collapsed in relief. He stumbled inside, his body screaming in pain, and placed Simba on the examination table. The storm had settled, but the night was far from over. Inside the dimly lit veterinary clinic, the air was thick with tension. Simba lay on the cold metal table, his breathing shallow, his fur still damp with blood. Inspector Adewale stood stiffly beside him, his fists clenched. Across from him, the exhausted veterinarian, Dr. Emeka, sighed heavily. I already told you, Dr. Emeka said, rubbing his temples. We are closed for the night. I can't. Adewale slammed his palm against the desk. This is not a request. His voice was low, dangerous. Dr. Emeka flinched. He had heard stories about Inspector Adewale, the man who never let a case go unsolved, the officer who once walked into a den of armed robbers alone and walked out with all of them in handcuffs. You don't understand, Adewale continued, his voice shaking with anger. This dog is the only witness to a murder conspiracy that goes deeper than we imagined. If he dies tonight, so does the truth. Silence. The vet hesitated. He looked at Simba, then back at Adewale. I can't risk my license, he muttered. Adewale took a step closer. Then risk something else. Dr. Emeka swallowed. I have a family, he whispered. Adewale's gaze didn't waver. And so did Tunde. That was it. The moment everything changed. The doctor exhaled sharply, grabbed a pair of gloves, and moved toward Simba. Fine, he muttered, but you owe me an explanation when this is over. Simba's treatment took hours. The bullet wound wasn't deep, but he had lost too much blood. Adewale sat in silence, his mind racing. Tunde had been poisoned, but the bullet that hit Simba, that wasn't random. Someone wanted the dog dead. But why? His phone buzzed. A message from forensic analysis. New toxicology report. The poison in Tunde's system was traced to a rare chemical, only accessible to pharmaceutical suppliers and government officials. Adewale's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the phone. Government officials. His mind went back to the night he interrogated Tunde's business partner. The man had been terrified, not just of getting caught, but of who might come after him. And then it clicked. The politician, the same one who had been present at the crime scene, pretending to be just another concerned observer. Adewale's hands trembled. This wasn't just a murder. This was an assassination. Simba stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open. Adewale sighed in relief. You made it, boy. But their relief was short-lived. A loud bang on the clinic's door, then another. They were here. Adewale's stomach twisted. He grabbed his gun, motioning for Dr. Emeka to stay back. Slowly, he opened the door. A gun was pointed at his face, and behind it, a fellow officer. Inspector Adewale, the officer said, his voice devoid of emotion. You need to come with us. Adewale's heart pounded. They had turned on him. Under whose orders? He asked, though he already knew the answer. The officer didn't reply, but he didn't have to. Adewale stepped back, just enough to shield Simba behind him. If you're going to arrest me, at least be honest. Are you working for the politician? A flicker of hesitation. And in that moment, Adewale knew. Run, Adewale whispered. Simba didn't move. Adewale's heart twisted. He understood. Simba had spent his whole life protecting Tunde. He had failed once. He wouldn't fail again. The officers stepped closer. Simba's ears flattened. He let out a deep, rumbling growl. Then he lunged. Gunshots exploded in the air. Adewale shouted, "Simba!" The world slowed. The officers yelled, stumbling backward. The gun fell from one of their hands. Simba, bloodied and weak, latched onto the man's arm with everything he had left. Adewale grabbed his chance. He knocked down the officer, grabbed his gun, and pointed it at the others. Nobody move. But then, Simba collapsed. No, 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 no. Adewale dropped beside him, hands trembling. Stay with me, boy, please. Simba's breathing was ragged. His tail gave one last weak wag. Then, he was still. Adewale's vision blurred. The room spun. The officers fled. But he didn't care anymore. Simba was gone. The morning after Simba's death, Adewale sat in his car, staring at his shaking hands. Blood was still on his sleeves, Simba's blood. He felt hollow, broken. But he wasn't done. Not yet. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Meet me at the abandoned warehouse by the docks. I have proof. Come alone. A trap? Maybe. Did he care? Not anymore. The warehouse smelled of rust and damp wood. Shadows stretched along the walls, and the only sound was the distant crashing of waves. Then, a figure stepped forward. It was one of the politician's former men, the same one who had tried to kill Simba. Now, he looked terrified. Adewale's voice was low, dangerous. You have 30 seconds to convince me not to put a bullet in you. The man swallowed. I was following orders. But after last night, I can't do this anymore. That politician, he kills anyone who steps out of line. I don't want to be next. Adewale crossed his arms. What do you have for me? The man hesitated, then pulled out a USB drive. This has everything, he whispered. Bank transactions, bribes, a video of him giving the kill order. Adewale snatched it, his heart pounding. This was it. The final nail in the coffin. The man took a shaky breath. You protect me, right? Adewale looked him dead in the eyes. You think I care what happens to you? The man paled. He knew he wouldn't survive this, and he didn't. A shot rang out. Adewale ducked, but the informant collapsed, blood spilling from his chest. Sniper. The politician knew. Adewale had two options, run or fight. He chose to fight. He grabbed the USB, jumped into his car, and sped straight to the media headquarters. By the time he arrived, the evidence was already being broadcasted nationwide. Phones rang. News anchors scrambled. The whole country watched as the truth unfolded. And then, sirens. At exactly 11:42 a.m., the politician was dragged out of his mansion in handcuffs. Cameras flashed. Reporters screamed questions. But Adewale? He didn't watch. He was already on his way back to Simba's grave. Because some victories don't feel like victories. As Adewale knelt beside the grave, he whispered, We did it, boy. The wind howled through the cemetery, and for the first time in years, Adewale let the tears fall. Simba had won, but the world had lost something precious. And so, I ask you, do you think justice was served, or was the price too high? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more real stories of bravery and sacrifice, subscribe, because sometimes the ones who fight the hardest are the ones we never deserved.